Hello, and welcome to the 2020 COVID-19 version of Books Sandwiched In. I'm here in my living room with this amateur production, so I hope nothing goes wrong. I hope you don't get too distracted by my unruly hair or that cats don't go running across the screen or something, but we'll see what happens. Happy to be here. My name is Ed Doherty, and those of you who don't know me, let me just tell you a little bit about me. After a long career in Rochester city government, I was fortunate to have another career for 8 years as vice president at Rochester Area Community Foundation. Among other things in that job, I got to do a lot of research and delve deeply into Rochester's dramatic concentration of poverty and really startling set of racial disparities. We produced a number of reports from all that work, one of which is called Hard Facts. I'll show you that here. A little hard to see this way, but I'm going to be talking a little bit about hard facts as we move through this presentation. But if you're interested in any of these reports, they are available to you at actrochester.org, actrochester.org. Today, I'm going to be spending time talking to you about a very important and well-written book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. The book was published in 2017. And it focuses on the history and legacy of racial segregation in the United States. A couple of things about Rothstein before we start. He is a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute. He is an emeritus senior fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute, which is at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And he's a senior fellow at the Haas Institute, University of California at Berkeley. He's written a number of books and numerous articles, mainly in the area of education. He was, in fact, the national education reporter, columnist for the New York Times from 1999 to 2003. So maybe you're familiar with his work through that. As we start this, there are two terms that Rothstein focuses on that are really critical to our understanding of what his key message is. First term is de facto. Of fact. We've heard it, we use it a lot. It's de facto this, de facto that. And the other term is de jure, which means of law. Rothstein contends that the great myth about segregation in America is that it, in fact, resulted from the de facto actions of ordinary Americans acting collectively and individually in their private capacity. So then, therefore, segregation is seen as being de facto. As he points out very compellingly, the complicity of governmental actions are dramatic and result in a significant degree to which we would refer to, or he refers to, segregation as being de jure, in other words, of law, resulting from these governmental realities. Now, of course, he acknowledges throughout the book that there's really a combination of both governmental and private prejudices at work that are the cause of our deep segregation. But because, from a legal standpoint, there's a tendency to ignore the de jure realities, he focuses on it. As a matter of fact, many courts have ruled that to the extent that segregation is seen as being de facto, that government doesn't have to do anything about it, basically. The logic is something like this. If government didn't cause it, it can't be required to fix it. But what Rothstein contends rather compellingly is that today's de jure segregation does have a significant governmental root to it, and therefore it is proper and necessary for government to take actions to deal with it and to remedy the problem. The author takes us on several tours in this book. This is my way of looking at it. The first tour is a geographical tour. He starts us out in the San Francisco area, where he talks about how wartime housing was being built just prior to and during World War II in a number of communities, and that the patterns that exist that were set into play really cast a long-term shadow and can be seen in today's segregated neighborhoods throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. I think he starts in San Francisco because he didn't want to start in the Deep South, and he kind of contends that this liberal bastion is also an area where we need to recognize that segregation is at play. Next, he goes to the southern and border state cities, St. Louis. Let's see, who else is on the list? St. Louis, Austin, Atlanta, Memphis, Louisville, Baltimore. And in fact, these are cities that have played a significant role in some of the government-sponsored approaches to segregation. But then he moves north, and he looks at the northern cities. He talks about Chicago and Cleveland, Detroit, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. He gets as close as Buffalo, mentions Buffalo, but I could find no specific mention of Rochester in his work. I did, however, find an interesting little tidbit that's not about Rochester, but makes a connection, and I'll touch on that later in my discussion. It's really the legal tour that is at the heart of Rothstein's research. He starts out with the constitutional prohibitions against discrimination. He talks about the 14th Amendment's equal protection requirements. He talks about due process requirements of the 5th Amendment. He also talks about the 13th Amendment, which we all know abolished slavery, but also has a second paragraph that specifically empowers Congress to act. So with all of this, Rothstein throughout the book refers to the unconstitutional discrimination that the government was practicing for many decades, resulting in the massive segregation that we have today. He gets into very specific pieces of legislation, and there's an awful lot here, so I'm only going to be able to hit the high points, but I'll try to keep it succinct and stick with his chronology. He starts off with the New Deal, and he talks about the Homeowner Loan Corporation, something that we don't know very much about because it didn't last very long. It was set up to rescue mortgages that were at risk during the Great Depression. Only mortgages held by white people. It wasn't so much that somebody decided that specifically, but that this was an insurance approach. The agency was going to insure these mortgages, the remortgages, that is to say. And they took the rather undefensible position that they couldn't risk mortgages in certain neighborhoods, and so as a result, the government really did, under the HOLC, as it was called, discriminate quite significantly. As I said, the agency didn't last long, but its legacy did. One of the things that they did was to hire local realtors to look at maps in every metro area in the United States and to color code them in a way that established where people of color were living, basically. And the color red was assigned to neighborhoods that were predominantly African American. The practice that we have learned, probably many of you know about, called redlining, initiated from there. And it's from that red coding that we found realtors for many decades continue to establish specific areas on maps where people who were white were steered in one direction, people who were black were steered in another direction. And this redlining had a profound effect. And realtors who did this didn't just do it because they were individually feeling that they should, or they were individually prejudiced, but this was actually elevated to the code of ethics for the real estate industry, where they were prohibited, basically, from taking actions that might result in introducing people of a different race into a neighborhood. And so starting with this government agency and leading up to practices of real estate agents for many decades, this redlining had a profound effect on communities. We see it here in Rochester for sure. The HOLC gave way to the Federal Housing Authority, called the FHA. And the FHA probably had the most profound effect of any agency on creating our massive segregation. The agency insured individual loans, individual mortgages, up to 80% of the housing value. This was pretty much unprecedented at the time. People who had means could buy a home, but home ownership was not quite that common among middle-class people, in part because the types of mortgages that you could get didn't have the kind of terms that we're familiar with today, where you pay down both the interest and the principal over an amortized period, and where you can mortgage a significant portion, as I said, up to 80% of the house values. Unfortunately, these were available only to white families. There are a handful of exceptions where African American neighborhoods were specifically permitted to participate in this program. But even there, it was only done if people were staying in neighborhoods of their own, so to speak. The FHA, like its predecessor, was an insurance agent, basically, and they were of the opinion that loans to people that were moving into integrated neighborhoods would be too risky for them to underwrite, and they simply stayed away from them. Now, interestingly, one of the things that Rothstein points out is the degree to which the FHA implemented its programs and efforts, not only with individual transactions, but they also worked with some of the huge developers that were looking to deal with the tremendous housing shortage that occurred after World War II. And they would insure such projects as the massive Levittown project on Long Island, which built more than 17,000 homes for whites only. And today it is still largely a white community. And the author looks at other projects throughout the country. He cites maybe about 10 of these very large projects where the FHA, in essence, gave prior approval so that the developers were confident that they would get the underwriting that they needed, but there were always conditions that they be segregated neighborhoods. Of course, once a house was built, we assume that people would be free to resell those homes to people of color. Not so fast, warns Rothstein. He shows how government helped to enforce and promote the private practice of establishing restrictive covenants to prevent people of color from buying homes in white areas. Restrictive covenants had been used in a lot of instances primarily to ensure conditions that were physical in nature, specifically architectural standards on homes. So if a house was built in a neighborhood that had a common architectural feature, you might put a restrictive covenant on it to make sure that continued. And today, we will even see some of that occurring. But during the 1940s, 50s, and into the 60s, restrictive covenants became very popular as a means of precluding resale of properties to non-white buyers. And this practice continued. In 1948, the Supreme Court actually ruled that court enforcement of these restrictive covenants was illegal. They didn't bar the practices, but said that the courts could not evict people who did it, who bought houses despite the covenants. So it did limit government's operation to a degree. But it certainly didn't end the practice. In fact, the FHA simply continued to underwrite mortgages and insure mortgages that had restrictive covenants on them. So they didn't review this as being something where the covenants were found to be inherently inappropriate. And Rothstein has some interesting quotes from the administrator, essentially saying, "My job is to insure houses, make sure houses are built. I don't need to worry about that social engineering stuff." You hear those terms over and over. It wasn't until the 1970s that the practice of restrictive covenants to prevent people of different races from living where they wanted was struck down by federal courts. And that, of course, was after the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. It was not only the federal government that helped create and sustain residential segregation. Rothstein's Chapter 8 is filled with examples of how state and local governments, the extents that they went to keep the races separate. Zoning was specifically used. Initially, zoning was used in a very explicit way. In some southern and border states, there were efforts to create zones that said exactly what they were intended to say. People of this race could live here, people of that race could live there, and that's the law. They treated those kinds of residential uses in the same way they might treat other kinds of uses. So a neighborhood could be designated as industrial or commercial or suitable for white residents. It was early on that the courts struck this down. It was 1917, as a matter of fact, in Buchanan versus Worley, that the Supreme Court found that this practice was, in fact, unconstitutional. But that, again, didn't stop too many people. There were efforts in many, many cities to develop plans and planning approvals, building permit and building lot approvals, that type of thing, to create the same intent without being explicit in their zoning ordinances. Again, Rothstein has some really major examples of how this happened. Zoning itself then became a little bit more nuanced in its effort to be restrictive. Zoning that had severe limits, even prohibitions on rental properties existed in places. Zoning that had minimum building lots to ensure that only people of means could live there, and severely limiting the likelihood that people of color would live there. There were other things in zoning laws that were done. Industrial zones or other types of zones were established to separate neighbors, physically separate neighborhoods and reinforce segregation. So even though the court struck down the overt nature of zoning for specific races, zoning has remained even today a tool that local governments often use to discourage or limit the degree of integration that occurs in their communities. But zoning wasn't the only practices that local governments had available to them. Many jurisdictions use locations of schools and school construction to encourage races to live in certain areas. They used their condemnation powers to create areas that were threatened by integration to become unavailable by building parkland instead of letting those areas continue to be available for residential uses. They created zones where they encouraged highway construction and some other tactics. And one of the tactics that many local governments did resort to was a sort of looking the other way when individuals when integrators, people who were willing to try to integrate neighborhoods were met with intimidation and actual violence, and Rothstein does document a number of these instances, and where the police refused to prevent it in the first place, refused to investigate afterwards, refused basically to see their governmental roles as extending to the realities of people of color. So it's hard to stop the legal tour because there's so much more in the book. I'm going to leave some for you to read. We just don't have the time to get through all of it. While Rothstein does focus his efforts using data and analysis, he also lets us know that there were real people behind these these situations that he's describing. I will discuss just 3 examples of these stories that he shares with us. Frank Stevenson was the son of a Louisiana preacher. He was one of 7 brothers. He, along with one of his brothers, moved to San Francisco when the possibility of wartime employment in wartime industries was growing. And he managed to find a job at a Ford assembly plant, something that did not happen very frequently for African Americans. But this was a plant that had been converted to wartime purposes, building military equipment, and the demand for workers was great, and they actually were hiring African Americans when they had not done so in the past. But Frank's ability to find housing was far more challenging. In fact, the story of him, this Ford plant was located in the city of Richmond, a suburb outside of San Francisco. And Frank had to look and look and look, and finally he had to move out of that city to an unincorporated area where he was able to find a boarding house, basically, where he could rent a single room. That actually is the good part of the story. After the war, the plant was moved 50 miles to the south in the San Francisco area, and none of the communities between where Frank was living and where his job went to would welcome him. He was not able to find housing anywhere near it, and for the next 20 years, he was required to commute to this job at great personal expense to him to keep the job. And it's just an example of how these things really impact people. Vince Meriday is a fascinating story. He's an individual who came from a middle-class black family. He was working construction, delivering construction materials to that Long Island community of Levittown when it was being built. And he really liked the community, so he applied to live there. And he met the financial requirements to do so, but was turned down. And he was turned down for an FHA guarantee, which meant he couldn't get a mortgage. He was able to get a mortgage eventually in a black enclave on Long Island where he didn't get the benefits of the FHA backing. He had to pay a higher down payment and had to pay a higher interest rate and had to buy a home that had much less appreciation value. Rothstein follows this and actually does some calculations over the lifetime of, I'm sorry, I might have said Frank, I meant Vince, over Vince's lifetime, and determined that the appreciation in value that Vince experienced over his lifetime was only about 20% of what he would have received had he been accepted into the Levittown community. So in other words, he was essentially robbed of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And this becomes significant because home equity is a major mechanism for passing intergovernmental wealth. And as much as our income gaps are significant, the gaps that exist in wealth between the races are huge. Final story, 1957. Bill and Daisy Myers were able to buy a house from a willing seller in the other Levittown, the one in Pennsylvania, and they managed to move in without anyone noticing until the mailman noticed and started telling everybody in the neighborhood. Over 600 people showed up. They pelted the house with rocks and tried significant amount of intimidation. They rented the vacant house next door, put up a Confederate flag, blared loud music, did everything that they could to intimidate this family. The local police responded, but were not able to do anything about it. The state police were called in, which resulted in local officials referring to this as state meddling. And so this was a very difficult situation for the Myers. They hung on for a couple of years, but after a few years, they sold and moved back to a predominantly black neighborhood in New York. There are many stories out here, and I wish I could tell some more of them, but you'll find them in the book. Rothstein outlines possible solutions, though very tentatively. He notes how long-lasting housing discrimination is. For example, if you end discrimination in bus seating theoretically, the next day the bus can be integrated. You might have some challenges getting there, but it would happen quickly. Whereas integrating whole communities will take generations and is an extensive long-term proposition. So his first solution is that we develop a common understanding. And while it sounds simple, I think it really is powerful. The notion that we need to teach middle and high school students the real history of how America was segregated, not the myth, not the de facto myth, or not the simple de facto myth anyway. He does suggest reparations, although he's very vague on the point. Not vague on how he would calculate them. He has a method. He looks at the difference between, like he did with the Merridays, the difference between what they might have made and actually did make in their home appreciations, given the discrimination that they faced. But he's very vague in terms of how such a system might be implemented and might be actually done, because that would be challenging. He calls for more stringent control on restrictive zoning, suggesting possibly that the deduction for home mortgage interest be restricted to communities that practice open zoning. So in other words, to have that available to your residents, you would have to earn it, not just get it, and be able to have it even if you were in a community that had restrictive zoning. His book is an excellent chronicle of how government supported segregation and how that led to real disparities in housing, income, wealth, and education. Today we hear voices that take us away from the question of integration. It's not surprising that there are voices among people of color who say basically, forget about integration. Instead, give us fair shake in housing, employment, education. We can understand that. It makes sense. But I guess this points to how the loss of interracial understanding, the loss of interracial trust, is another victim of this history, and something that really is significant. So how does all this apply to Rochester? I was intrigued when I read the St. Louis story, where they were very effective in developing plans that managed to keep highly segregated areas. And I saw the name of a firm called Harlan Bartholomew, who were planning engineers hired by St. Louis. I remembered my days as Commissioner of Environmental Services, where I learned that there was something called Bartholomew lines in Rochester. And basically they were the setback or right-of-way lines along most of the public streets. And they were designed in the 1920s when Rochester hired the Bartholomew firm, the same one that St. Louis used, to develop many of its plans. Now, I can't make a direct connection between that and the segregation in Rochester, but I can tell you that data that we've looked at more recently shows that Rochester is among the more segregated communities in the country, that our past patterns continue today. In the hard facts work, we took a look at the impact of a lot of different factors on minorities, comparing both within the region, how different people of different racial groups fared, but also how people of racial groups here compared to racial groups nationally. And so we found that not only did African Americans here have a dramatically lower home ownership rate than whites did, but African Americans in Rochester have a significantly lower home ownership rates than African Americans have throughout the country. So there's some good reason to think that Rochester's history was very much similar to that which was being described by Bartholomew. So, not Bartholomew, I'm sorry, I got confused there, by Rothstein, and perhaps reinforced by Bartholomew. This is the book. I didn't show it at the beginning. I had intended to. I highly recommend it. I think you'll find it to be excellent reading. If you're interested in more information, there's plenty available. You can see plenty of reviews and video clips of the book. The Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library has an excellent clip that shows Rothstein himself making a presentation that I found very, very interesting and very useful, so you might want to think about that. And if you're interested in more on the local realities, I highly recommend the ACT Rochester website to you. So in closing, I found this a riveting book. It's a book that documents a lot of things that we've taken as sort of hearsay over the years. Many of us, if you're like me, knew about redlining, knew about FHA's work, but I never saw it well documented. And so that makes this a very, very important history for our nation as we go forward. If you have any need to or interest in continuing the conversation directly with me, feel free to email me. I am at Edward J. Doherty, that's one word, Edward J. Doherty @gmail.com. That's pretty easy to remember. Appreciate your attention today. Thank you, and hope everyone stays safe, and can't wait till the time we can see you in the library or the coffee shop or somewhere else more public. Thanks, everybody.